It's being called a wake-up call for Kansas City. So what were the other 80-plus murders in our city this year? Now the search is on for a fix. Is there one that will actually work? Also this half hour, waving the white flag in the so-called border war. But is this really the end of a decades-old bi-state business battle? Those stories and the rest of the Metro's most impactful headlines dissected next on Week in Review.
Week in Review is made possible through the generous support of Dave and Jamie Cummings, Bob and Marlise Gorley, Smithfield Foods, Haas and Wilkerson Insurance, the Courtney S. Turner Charitable Trust, John H. Mize and Bank of America N.A. co-trustees, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Nick Haynes, and thank you for joining us on this journey through the news of the week in this place we call home, connecting the dots on the top stories making news here in our metro. Mr. Up-to-Date on KCOR-FM, Steve Kraske. The senior writer for the Call newspaper, Eric Wesson, leading the editorial board of your Kansas City Star, Colleen Nelson, and tracking the news from behind a microphone at KCMO Talk Radio, Pete Mundo. The biggest national headline of the week was two mass shootings that claimed the lives of 29 people, and all in less than 14 hours. While the scope of the tragedy certainly was not as large here in our backyard, Kansas City police responding to 7 homicides in 1 week.
We've got a problem in Kansas City.
I've said it before and I'll say it again, our city should not accept this violence.
Among the dead, a 25-year-old Overland Park woman randomly killed by a bullet at the popular First Fridays event in the Crossroads. That death prompting new demands for a fix to Kansas City's intractable homicide rate. The Kansas City Star describes it as a wake-up call for the community. Were the other 80-plus murders in Kansas City so far this year not a wake-up call, Colleen?
Well, they should have been, and we've written that a lot on the Kansas City Star editorial page, basically just kind of pounding our fists and saying, why isn't anyone talking about this? Why aren't we doing everything we can as a community to deal with the violent crime issue? And so it shouldn't have taken a shooting at First Friday to focus in on this, but I think just kind of the random nature of this, there were so many people there. It was a public gathering. It was a woman waiting in line for a food truck with her boyfriend, an innocent bystander, and I think that really hits home for a lot of people, just saying that could have happened to me.
Why was that such the tipping point, Steve? Is it because this was a white woman from Johnson County? Was it because of the place itself where other people may gather and put themselves in that? Or was it her own social networks where the father was a pastor at the largest church in Kansas City, and she also worked at a domestic violence shelter that would have a lot of connections that would have amplified this?
I think it was a little bit of each of those things, Nick, but I want to emphasize one thing. This happened at First Fridays, outside of the Chiefs and the Royals. This is the biggest gathering of Kansas Cityans that I can think of on a regular basis in this town. And when you have a shooter doing what he allegedly did with police officers stationed just within a block of where the shooting take place, that begins to say a whole lot about where this city is right now and what needs to be done.
Eric?
It has a bad optic. You can call it a wake-up call or anything. People are on 18th and Vine. We've had 3 homicides on 18th and Vine. People were in line. A gentleman got killed down there. But the optic looked like it's a white woman from Johnson County. Hey, let's respond, because there were no press conferences for any other the black people that have gotten killed. And I think during the thing, one of the things that disturbed me more than anything was Chief Rick Smith, and I did an editorial about him a couple of weeks ago. Is he getting a free pass because he's not addressing it? So he comes out, he gives this speech, but in the speech he says it's a geographical issue, meaning, translation, people in the black community accept this, so that's their problem, but now it's west of truth, and it's a totally different conversation. Even the prosecutor's department, I've been at the call for 16 years. I've never seen the prosecutor send out a charge sheet with the victim's picture on it. And that was something that was kind of some racial undertones. So I believe in the black community, it's like, okay, all these black people got killed. Y'all didn't say anything. Now a white woman from Johnson County gets killed, and we got to come up with solutions. We got to come up with all these different things. So it's a bad optic.
Well, I'll say this, as someone that is doing a show every morning, this has been the issue for the past year and a half. And this past
But as
regime,
much as you saw this week?
Well, this brought it to the top of the forefront for people that weren't paying attention. You're right about that. The people that were focused on local politics, what's been going on, this has been the topic. But I think there's just as much, if not more, socioeconomic. And these people that are not used to being in the communities where this is happening, to Eric's point, are now experiencing this and say, hey, I could have been there. I'm a block down the road. That could have been me. And now it comes to the forefront because of that reason. It's touristy, and it brings people into that environment that aren't used to being part of it.
Well, there's now, of course, a lot of soul searching for solutions. New Mayor Quinton Lucas is proposing an ordinance banning juveniles from possessing a handgun, and he's toying with a gun buyback program. Former Mayor Sly James said gun buyback programs don't stop shootings. In a 2013 blog post, Mayor James wrote, buyback programs haven't brought down the deadly numbers. No one turns in their real guns anyway, just the old broken ones for which they have no use. So what does Quinton Lucas know that Sly James didn't?
I think it's a situation where he had to do something. And so that was one of the things. And if you notice the reaction that has been historical in Kansas City, the plaza, a shooting, they immediately react to it with a curfew. In other parts of the city where these things happen, there's something symbolically done. And Mayor James is right. Gun buyback programs, they did one in Arizona, their homicide rate went up during the period they were doing the gun buyback. And there's issues where people will stand in line, and where people are going to give $100 for their gun, there are people in line saying, I'll give you $125 for it or $150, and they sell the gun in line while they are waiting to turn their guns in. Most of the time it's rusty guns in the bottom of your closet that don't shoot anyway. And people bring those guns in.
Steve.
Well, and that's Mayor James' point about those gun buyback programs, Nick. But I think Eric is exactly right. And we have a new mayor here. This is the biggest issue on his plate right now. And his tenure begins with this spate of violence that has everybody reeling. He has to do something. He has to react in some ways. We can argue gun buyback programs for a long time, but $50,000 maybe to get 1,500, 1,800 guns off the streets. A lot of folks would take that bargain, that deal, if it saves 1 or 2 lives. He's already come up with these creative ways, if you will, to begin to get minors, get guns away from minors. That story out today. He has to show leadership. He has to show action. Say what you will about Quinton Lucas. That man is everywhere at once. He's going to be a very activist kind of mayor. We're going to be seeing a lot of him in the news.
You mentioned taking away the guns of juveniles, but the federal law says a juvenile cannot carry a gun, and even Missouri state law, there is a code there that says you have to be 19 to be able to open carry or have a concealed weapon. So aren't those laws already in place, Colleen?
They are. Mayor Lucas says that they're not being consistently enforced, and he says by virtue of making it a municipal offense, this will send the message to our police that this should be consistently and aggressively enforced. And I think it's easy to Steve's point, I think it's easy to point out the imperfections with any of these measures. A gun buyback isn't going to do it all. The municipal offense on juveniles in possession is not going to do it all. But Quinton Lucas has to try everything he can, and he has to show that this is his #1 priority. And I had a conversation this week with Congressman Emanuel Cleaver, and he said his advice to Mayor Lucas is everywhere you go, you talk about this. If you go to the Peaches Festival, you say, I love peaches, and reducing violent crime is my top priority. And you have to talk about this everywhere, every day, and send the message that this is our focus.
Now, some people are asking, why is it that we're not putting more police officers on the streets? They note there are fewer Kansas City police officers on the street today than there were 5 years ago. And according to data from Governing magazine, Kansas City also has fewer officers per citizen, certainly much less than St. Louis and big cities like Chicago and New York. Do more officers, though, on the street deter crime?
The jury's out on that. But I think in the visibility, if you talk to a lot of retired police officers, they refer to boots on the ground. Maybe you do need to have more officers in high impact areas, just as a deterrent. I was reading something in Cleveland, Ohio, when they had an upswing in crime. They took police cars with tinted windows and parked them in high crime areas. And it was a deterrent because nobody knew whether there was actually a policeman in that car or not. But it created something different just by having them there.
Even the police chief doesn't seem to be convinced. He mentions in his press conference this week, Pete, that the shooter involved in the First Friday's event, there were police officers in the same parking lot when it happened.
Yeah, I think that situation is obviously different than what's happening where these shootings are traditionally happening. But to Quentin Lucas's point, I mean, he has made this very clear. He wants to increase the number of police officers in this force. It's down from the past 5 years. It's not where they wanted it to be 50 years ago when you look at some of those projections. So it's clear that is at the top of his list. I know he can't do it alone, but I know that he wants to get that done.
Now, over in the Crossroads, which puts on the First Friday's event, organizers are talking about shutting things down earlier in the evening. Some city leaders talking about expanding the city's curfew law to include the Crossroads district. Currently, Power and Light, Westport, the Plaza, Zona Rosa have curfews in place where children under the age of 18 cannot be on the streets without a parent after 9 o'clock at night. But the one arrested in the First Friday's shooting was not under 18. So how would that solve the problem?
You know, I'm not sure it would. Again, I think there's a theme to our conversation here this morning, Nick, is that we're looking at any number of small measures that hopefully aimed at a greater good going forward. You know, my sense is the leadership of the city the last 6-8 months has been pretty quiet as the crime rate continued to climb. Now we're starting to see some action, some new energy with the new mayor. You know, folks better strap their seatbelts on and get ready to be patient for a while because nothing's going to happen overnight. This is a long, multi-year project and process the new mayor is going to go through, and just hang on, folks.
Now, lost in a lot of the coverage on the homicides this week was Mayor Lucas spending his first night as mayor experiencing life at a rental property on Kansas City's east side where he could experience the family's housing problems and the sound of gunfire throughout the night. Some were quick to claim it was a stunt, but does Mayor Lucas deserve some credit for trying, Eric?
Yes, absolutely. The KC tenants, that was one of the agreements that he made with them. He fulfilled that in going out and staying to witness firsthand some of the conditions that some of these slumlords have their rental properties in. So it was a great opportunity. It just got lost in the shuffle.
It's a huge win. I mean, yes, there's optics behind it, but to the point of what Steve was making, it has been pretty quiet in this city from the previous regime to all the problems and the increasing homicide rate. Whether it's good for publicity's sake, it may be, but it's also good to show that the new leader of this city is in these communities, is caring about it, and is focused on it.
It's easy to concentrate on the doom and gloom, but certainly there were positive things happening here in our hometown this week. Kansas City getting national TV attention as the country's greatest gymnasts compete at Sprint Center, the downtown arena playing host to the U.S. Gymnastics Championship going on through Sunday. And the Chiefs are finally back, their first preseason game this weekend. It seems like a lot of people were far more excited about these two events than taking part in the democratic process. It was Election Day on Tuesday, and did anybody go? Turnout in Johnson County was 8%, just a tiny bit higher in Jackson and Wyandotte counties. Steve, these were the local school boards, city council races, a few nickel and dime, pennies on the dollar, local issues. We weren't voting for president or Congress, after all.
Well, and that was the issue. There was no primary for governor or the U.S. Senate or Congress on this ballot, Nick. It really required a lot of focus for voters to go out and vote in these primary elections, and not many people did.
And it seemed like most of the incumbents actually won, so there wasn't major change that took place.
Correct. Most of the incumbents won, but when you look at a race like the Johnson County Community College Board of Trustees, it'll be interesting to see how the general election plays out because, as we talked about here last week, a lot of discord at that college over rising tuition rates, discord between the faculty and the administration. The challengers here will probably wage pretty aggressive campaigns against the incumbents.
In Lee Summit, they voted to approve more funding for public safety, and in Independence, they voted in a tax that will put more police officers on the streets. Is that a solution for Kansas City, which, as we point out, has fewer police officers, fewer proportionate to the population, Eric?
No, the demographic area or the geographic area of Kansas City is different. So I don't know if they could put a tax on that would allow them to hire more police officers. But I think the only reason why it got passed in Independence was because they put the cruelty to animals on top of that bill, and nobody wanted to kill a cat or a dog, so they voted it in because most people were like, no, we have enough taxes in Independence.
Well, some are already back. Others are getting ready to go back to school next week. How about sending your kids back with a bulletproof backpack? Office Max in the Metro now offering them alongside the pencils, crayons, and folders. They cost about $200, but for some parents, there's no price you can place on peace of mind. The sales comes just as a governor's task force in Missouri has concluded that the state's schools would be safer if there was an armed resource officer in every school. But who would pay for these new armed resource officers? Is it the state finding money for that, or would the schools be responsible, Colleen?
Well, the schools would be responsible. This would be a pricey proposition. And just to go back for 1 second, I think the idea of a bulletproof backpack should send a shiver down everyone's spine. The fact that we even have to talk about that or think about sending kids to school wearing a $200 bulletproof backpack. But yes, the mayor's task force the governor's task force in Missouri came out and said every school should have an armed guard or an armed employee, possibly teachers in some cases, which a lot of teachers don't want to be forced to carry a gun at school. And so the question is, are more guns in our schools really the answer? Are making our schools armed fortresses really the only way that we can keep our kids safe?
And these sales, though, of these backpacks are going through the roof, though.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm not shocked by that. You know, as a parent myself, not someone of a school-age child, it's something you're going to be thinking about. It's reality. You can pretend that it's not there. You can say, hey, this might be an investment worthwhile, and that's up to each parent. I'm not surprised sales are up. I know it's going to be debated at the local and at the state level, but this conversation's not going anywhere, and if the state wanted to really take some action, they might be able to find some funding for it on their end.
It's been talked about for years. Is it finally over? I'm talking about the so-called business border war between Kansas and Missouri, where companies can move a few feet over the state line and be rewarded with millions of dollars in tax breaks. Kansas Governor Laura Kelly says enough is enough. She's signed an executive order preventing state tax incentives being used to recruit existing businesses from the Missouri side of the metro. Kelly's order follows a similar commitment from Missouri Governor Mike Parson issued in June. It sounds great, but there are too many loopholes that make this more symbolic than meaningful, Steve?
Well, I think it's a big step forward, Nick. There's no question about that. I think officials on both sides of the state line are saying, finally, this is starting to happen. There is a loophole here, and that is that cities and counties aren't bound by these state agreements here. Quentin Lucas, again, Mr. Energy, is already signaling he wants to deal with this, get Kansas City on board, and lobby other area communities to get on board with this as well. I think that'll happen. The spirit, the political tenor right now seems to suggest that everyone wants this border war to go away for good.
And they can still offer states incentives if a company is willing to give even more jobs. So, hey, I'm going to offer 50 more jobs to move to the other side. Oh, and we'll get some state incentives.
Exactly. There's a lot of loopholes that'll make that happen. Ironically, after that, Hostess announced that they were moving out of Kansas City. They didn't announce where they're moving, but I'm pretty sure it's probably going to be to someplace in Johnson County.
So we're still going to be talking about this on this program for a while, all right. Well, this weekend marks the 5th anniversary of the fatal shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. The police officer who killed Brown was later cleared of any criminal charges, but Brown's death set off a wave of unrest and rioting and sparked a vigorous national debate about the relationship between law enforcement officers and African Americans. While some things have changed, a report from the state attorney general finds black drivers in Missouri are 91% more likely than white motorists to be pulled over by police. And the gap is not shrinking, it's growing. In fact, if you live in Blue Springs, you're 275% more likely to be stopped if you're black, according to the report. Why, given all of the talk, though, and recognition of this issue, has that number got worse, not better, Eric?
There's no consequences. They hold some money up for 3 or 4 weeks that the state gives to these law enforcement agencies, but there's no consequences. I remember when Kevin Costner was not Kevin Costner, Chris Costner. I'm thinking about a movie. When he was the Attorney General,
this probably will end up being one.
He spoke of there not being enough teeth in the legislation that gives Attorney Generals the right to do something. So without having any concrete evidence or teeth in any of the bills, then it's going to continue to be a problem.
Not all law enforcement, though. I mean, they say there's reasons why this is happening, including the fact that they are, African-American areas where people are more lower income are more likely to be policed than in areas where white people live. So they're more likely to be picked up by police, thus the increase in incidents.
Yeah, which really gets back to a socioeconomic conversation, right? I mean, if you're going to the areas where more of the crime is, that's where they are. If that's what the racial breakdown is, then those numbers are on a percentage base going to be higher. I just think you can't get around the math behind that.
Well, I think there's just been an unwillingness to dig into what the numbers actually mean. And so this report comes out every year, and Missouri in particular just kind of collectively shrugs its shoulders, and lawmakers do nothing. And we see these numbers. We see that African Americans are 91% more likely to be pulled over in Missouri. And every year the number gets a little bit worse, and every year the legislature just says, okay, we've received the report. And so at some point you have to dig deeper and say, what does this mean? Why is this happening? And what do we need to do?
I did try to dig deeper this week because I was interested. Why are all these stories about Missouri? Why don't you ever hear it about Kansas? I tried to look up what was happening in Kansas on this issue. Was Kansas doing a better job than Missouri? Now, after exhaustively searching for that data, the answer is there isn't one. Most police departments in Kansas don't even break down traffic stops by race. So you have a better chance of finding out whether a driver stopped by the police in Kansas was in a Toyota Camry or a Ford Focus than whether they were black or white, Steve.
Yes, and that needs to change. I just want to go back to the Ferguson thing, Nick, and this is stunning to me that, 5 years after Ferguson, the conversation is what it is, 91% more likely for a black to be stopped than a white person. That is just unbelievable given the wretched turmoil this state went through back 5 years ago with Ferguson burning, tens of millions of dollars in damage, Governor Jay Nixon unable to deal with it, national attention, and here we sit 5 years later, the numbers getting worse, and you just shake your head and wonder what's going on, and you're so right. There's no conversation about this whatsoever.
We're only picking one indicator, but there are others, and there have been improvements, including the fact that more than half of the city council in Ferguson, which used to be white, is now black. A majority of the police officers in Ferguson are African American. They even have an African American police chief.
Yeah, there were some symbolic changes, but overall in the state, it's still the same thing. And one of the things that people have expressed concern about, even with Mayor Lucas's new ordinance, will that open the door for more police frisk and search? And when you get into cities like Blue Springs and even Kansas City, you have, out of all their deputy chiefs, you have one black deputy chief. He can retire at any place at any day now, and you only have one other person that can move into that spot. So the racial sensitivity is not pushed in a lot of these cities. Blue Springs really doesn't have a crime area, and I dread why they have so many stops of black people going through Blue Springs.
Let's talk about a sensitivity of another kind now. Last week it was a local story playing out on local social media. Now it's become a national news item after Republican congressional candidate Sarah Hart Weir announced she was taking on new Kansas Congresswoman Sharice Davids last week. She says she's been blasted for her looks. It's a story getting her lots of new attention.
A Republican congressional candidate is facing criticism from the left, but not over her policy. It's because of how she looks. A progressive political activist tweeting, quote, "Do you think it's a coincidence Kansas Republicans are recruiting attractive young women to run for office?"
They're sexist. And this isn't just an attack against me. It's not just an attack against Republican women. This is an attack against women everywhere.
We're hearing this is a deliberate strategy of Republicans. Is it a deliberate strategy?
I don't think so. I always say this. When you talk about privilege in this society, in this culture, good looks matter, all right? Good looks help you as a man. They help you as a female. It doesn't matter. I don't think there's a deliberate strategy to find men or women that are better looking to run for Congress. I just think sometimes that happens. And it's a nonsensical accusation to make with no basis of facts behind it.
Don't both major parties, though, try to recruit certain kind of candidates who they think are going to make a difference with voters? For instance, we see Democrats love it when somebody has a military background and they think that's going to work well in a crossover type of areas, Colleen.
Absolutely. And I think that Republican leaders in the area probably have given some thought about what kind of candidate might do well against Sharice Davids. And so I'm not so cynical as to think they said we need to recruit an attractive woman. But I think that there was some thinking among Republicans that a woman running against Sharice Davids would have a better chance in this swing district where Republicans are very worried about how women view Trump and whether they're going to suffer the consequences chances. And so I think having a woman face off with Sharice Davids gives Republicans a better chance, assuming that she's a credible, impressive candidate, and we'll learn that over the coming months. But
I think those are great points. And I also want to point out for context, Nick, this was one Democratic activist pointing this out on Twitter without much substantiation to it whatsoever. I also want to point out, I don't know Sarah Hart-Weir, but she spent 4.5 years as the CEO of the National Down Syndrome Society, a national organization that seems to be a fairly impressive credential. I think we can all go ahead and just view her for what her positions are and who she is, and I think this is going to blow away pretty quickly.
What about the news that the latest entrant in the race for United States Senate in Kansas is an openly gay Republican who supports the re-election campaign of Donald Trump? Is Brian Pruitt, the former director of the political news blog RedState.com, getting the same bashing on social media as being part of the orchestrated campaign to find different kinds of Republican candidates to run for political office? Pete?
Not that I'm aware. I don't think that he is somebody who, great candidate, had him on the show, seemed like a bright young man. He's clearly running a very grassroots campaign, appears to have no financial backing behind him. I don't believe at this point he's a candidate with a chance. I just think he's a guy coming back to his home state. He's from the Wichita area, trying to build himself back up. But I don't think it's a concerted effort by anybody in leadership to bring an openly gay man to Kansas to run for Senate.
Steve?
I agree with that. I don't think there's anything to that. And again, let's give Sarah Hart-Weir a chance to sort of espouse her views, and I think this thing will blow away fast.
And finally, is meeting at a church the latest no-go zone for schools? In Lee Summit, teachers are protesting a convocation meeting that the district wanted to force them to go to, which is in a church they believe is anti-gay. They've forced that move now. Eric, does it make a difference? Should schools be involved in anything at a church?
Yes, they should be. Well, in the urban core, they should be, because the church and the school should be partners. So they should work together. I think Lee Summit, they just got a lot of issues going on out there, and they just use that as an excuse.
But we have school districts who meet, for instance, at the Church of the Resurrection for graduation. We meet to vote in churches, Pete.
I think you can have events at these churches, and if, as long as they're not waving flags or, flashing signs that, people might not be offended by, I see no problem with it. It's good to have that balance and have that connection.
But there's a sensitivity issue, though, here, Nick, though. Just imagine you're a gay high school kid and you see your entire faculty and staff meeting at this church that has the reputation that it does. It sends the wrong kind of message in a city that has been struggling with racial equity issues with the former school superintendent. You see a sensitivity issue still coming to the fore in Lee's Summit.
And that is our Week in Review. I'm Nick Haynes. From all of us here at KCPT, thanks for spending part of your weekend with us.